So, on to the big questions about predestination, destiny, free will, and the big questions I almost want to be careful delving into about, if God exists, what is his nature, um, why are things as difficult as they are, and what's the point of living. So, to begin, I'm just gonna kind of create my own life story. I'm not gonna say that this is going to work for everybody. I actually encourage that people discuss this with themselves and with other kind of peers to decide how they want to integrate the different meanings and what they want to kind of decide is going to work for them as a philosophy of life. Uh, I do believe in fate and that we do have free will at the same time. So because I studied the Hindu scriptures and I have a little bit of an understanding of reincarnation and rebirth, I am trying to continually remind myself of this. And it took a long time for me because I have a idea in my mind that once we die, it's almost like we're going to be on a different plane, and that's just going to be it. We're not going to come back to the actual physical world. I have this idea in my mind, and it's still very hard for me to kind of separate and align with the idea of rebirth and coming back into the physical world. So it's almost like, well, how can you possibly have both? And it does go back to what I was mentioning before about if you have a tradition that you're accustomed to living and seeing with, and then go into another tradition, you're going to have to keep an open mind before judging it and then decide afterwards how these two can kind of integrate and make sense together. So, with Buddhism, they don't necessarily believe in a soul. What they believe is in once you've been in the world long enough, and I'm just kind of giving like a broad summary. I haven't actually reviewed it in several years, but from what I can glean and what I've kind of internalized and kind of made relevant to my way of understanding the world is if I've been in the world for, let's say, my lived existence right now is 40 years old, and I spent the first 30 years of my life just trying to be kind to others, not really trying to inflict harm anywhere, and I died. So I die at 30. And to anybody, it would be just like, well, let's just assume that they had a good end and that was it. Like, we don't know, I guess, whether or not their faith actually helped them, we can't say. Whether the religion was accepted as, because you studied Islam versus Christianity or Judaism, we don't know which one actually was kind of helpful for you in any way in the end. Only I can kind of know that if you understand that we have some kind of uh, conscious awareness of our previous existence. So if you think of consciousness and you think, I never used to think that I would believe in a cycle of rebirth, but now that I'm thinking about it, what would I have been in a previous life? So you can bring that into a context of, well, my life right now is pretty karmically healthy. Like, I don't feel like I'm overstepping any boundaries and transgressing about anybody or transgressing anybody's rights. I don't feel like I'm in any particular rut where I can't find a way to problem solve. Um, Internally, like, my meanings for life, they resonate with me and they kind of give me satisfaction. So from that, I almost assume, and I want to assume for myself, like an optimistic, like, oh, maybe I've had like a positive past, and this is almost like it's healthily reinforcing itself for me. So it almost allows me to venture out of what's a norm that's typically you assumed to be right action. So, for example, I've started to wonder about substances, so like alcohol and marijuana, things I hadn't done previous to uh, being 30. I think like it was like 38 or something, or 37, that I started to experiment with those. And I guess that's just the nature of what it is. So with Buddhism, the belief is that attachment to anything in the world is sort of what causes suffering. So I never had a relationship. I didn't really have anything outside of my family and just my internal struggles with tradition that kind of occupied my mind. So being someone who was almost tested with my family, not necessarily supporting or standing in the way of the way I'm thinking, was its own kind of like help in a way in helping me not build too much attachment that's going to affect my heart in any way, or like my emotional state or my emotional health. So I just kind of retreated into myself and allowed myself to be the introvert that I am. It's not that I've written them off and I don't talk to them. Like extended family, I've kind of just like any other family. It's the odd time that you get together and that's it. But with that, like I don't really know how to understand nirvana. Like with the progression of life and death and coming back into the world, is there a point where you just don't? I don't know. That's a question. If you have a understanding that you can experience several lifetimes in one lifespan, I mean, what would you assume of that? Like some people, I've had this experience where sometimes when I'm sleeping and if I smoke marijuana, I can literally almost feel myself in between state where I like, is my soul actually leaving my body as I'm drifting off to sleep? And then where does it go? Because you wonder what dreams are. And well, if I go to the Buddhist tradition, who don't believe in souls, like maybe not everybody dreams. I know my dad, he used to tell me he didn't dream. So who knows? Like all these are really valid interpretations of life and reality. And it's, I feel really enriched that I had the opportunity to study because my traditional understanding of Islam didn't almost allow for these nuanced understandings of our kind of metaphysical existence. So when I kind of go back to understanding what I originally knew previous to studying like in a kind of broad expanse of all the world religions, the idea of death was just that. I just wait in the grave, as it were, as a soul, and then once creation kind of comes to an end, it's very linear the way it was. It was almost like once creation comes to an end, it's just going to be this plane, and then we're all going to be resurrected and judged, and then there's going to be like a pit of fire, and then there's going to be like this garden, and people are going to decide, or God's going to decide, or people are going to have a record, and it's going to explain that, well, this was your action in the world, so this is where your end is, and then sometimes it's just an amount of time that you have to kind of work off what your missteps were, and then you're allowed to enter the garden. So this could be something that we can now, and I just kind of love reinvestigating from like a Buddhist or a Hindu understanding that doesn't really create that linear time. It almost creates it into a cycle, and it creates so much rich meaning with how hell isn't a pit of fire. It's literally the consequence of our actions creating difficulties in our life that make it really difficult to exist. So let's, for example, say that I died at 30, right? So I believe in the soul and I died in my sleep. But then I woke up, and waking up in, like, how am I supposed to know that my soul's there or not? But I do realize a significant change in my existence. Like my life suddenly has gotten really, really difficult. Things don't make sense anymore. So this can actually delve into mental health. Like what happened? Like there seems to be some kind of shift, and I have no way of knowing what to attribute it to. So this goes back to what I mentioned in the previous video, where out of time and space, certain pockets of actions that are really significant impact other ones, and they're completely outside of our control. So if I have family members that did something, even extended family, like 2 or 3 degrees away, and from different generations who have done something, and it just cycles back to my personal life, like even genetically or through history. That's just something that's in my history now, and I have to kind of figure out how to deal with it. So the fact that my lifespan can be divided up into segments becomes something I have to contend with. So this is kind of like the story of Job, where he had his entire existence where it was really easy, you know, nothing that was difficult. And then suddenly everything's really, like, he got really sick, he lost his family. They wouldn't even approach him because it was like a contagious disease. And he just found himself almost like exiled out of his life. And the narration suggests that he could have asked to be alleviated from this distress, but he chose not to because he felt like metaphysically, why should I feel entitled to have like a consistently easy life? We know that life in the world is not a utopia. And if I've had, you know, a significant, like 70 years, let's say, of absolute ease, why can't I struggle for a little bit just to even have compassion to other, or for other fellow humans as to what difficulty is, and then I can appreciate what, you know, what I did have, and maybe be more giving, or maybe that'll just create some kind of alternative view for seeing the world, and it just creates a more robust human. So that's kind of what is really interesting for me right now. So having this perspective, it was almost like, okay, my dad passed away, and since then there have been dramatic shifts in my existence naturally. Like, there's different roles that kind of shift and responsibilities. But for me, it was like, okay, what if my dad passing away was his body, but then somehow his soul returns to the world somewhere, right? So I'm thinking about this, but I'm thinking about it in a way that's also aligned with how, I mean, I used to think he didn't have a soul because he used to tell me he didn't dream. And then in another realm, it was, but he didn't even believe in Buddhism or Hinduism. Like, he was like kind of like a relaxed, practicing Muslim, you could say. So all of these things was almost like, for me, it was like, it doesn't really necessarily matter what you believe. Like, reality is going to be reality, and your soul's going to, what's going to happen to it's going to happen to it. So that was like something to think about. And I don't know if you had this, people talk about deja vu, where sometimes you meet somebody and you're like, you really remind me of so and so. So all these kind of existential experiences for me have been really like, they've given me so much pause about how to think about these big questions, and how to kind of have compassion with yourself and with people who identify as atheists, who struggle with these questions and almost want to give up. And they get really, really frustrated with people of religion or tradition who kind of give these blanket statements as, well, just believe. Like, how can you not look at God, I mean, nature, and assume that God exists? Because look at the design and look at how things manifest. And that's good, but it doesn't, sometimes we need a little bit more, because it's just so complex, and there's new ways of understanding, and we're able to access life in so many different ways now, like with travel and technology and research and medicine. And so with that in mind, it is important to know that these stories are going to be anecdotal. There's not going to be any right way of saying this is the way it is, because it's almost like what you make of your life and the stories that you tell yourself to kind of make it make sense is basically what religion is, right? So it's a personal thing that somehow emanates from a belief in an ultimate being, and it's not something that's supposed to be forced. So that's why religion and politics don't often coincide well. Like, if you're going to be someone who's in political office, typically these kind of discussions don't even come up, right? This is something that's like philosophy, and it's, if it comes up in politics, it's almost just like, to what degree are we allowed to consider practices or rituals that maybe that look inhumane, for example, and then we have to kind of step back and consider, like, what are the origin stories, and why do we practice this way if, you know, it's a group of people within themselves in the political office, assuming that, okay, it was left to us to kind of decide how we're supposed to deal with this because we can relate to it, and we're supposed to maybe reflect for our community outside on how we can support them. So I don't know how to understand for anybody in particular how to answer or kind of address these big questions, and the only way I know how is to kind of give my own stories and kind of explain how going towards an aim uh, is basically all we're asked to do. So if you're thinking about, okay, we're predestined to live in the world. Like, I'm born, and that means that destiny's already written out for me. I'm fated to do these many things. Why have free will? Like, why should I assume that I have free choice? Why don't I just relax and just assume that what's meant for me is going to be? So that is a choice, but it almost assumes that my grappling with time in the future is just going to be that much more difficult because my understanding of the world and life is going to be already limited. So if we think of life as our commitment to ourself is to engage with life, that is our purpose, and in doing so we're already meeting some of the objectives of living. And if you have your mind kind of oriented towards that, you're going to want to understand reality, and you're going to want to understand, like, if things are fated for me and I decide to do something one way, should I worry about the goal? Like, is the goal kind of supposed to correlate with my choices? And for me, I'm more like, the more I think about this, the more I think there is literally almost never a correlation. So if I give you an example, in 2001 I graduated high school, and I didn't like, university was like, I was almost dreading it. I was like, I don't even know. Like, I studied all the hard sciences in high school, assuming that I'd go into med school or something. And it was just like, I'd have no interest in any of this. But it was the tradition, like, it was almost the expectation. Like, once you finish high school, this is what you're going to do. So I gave it some thought, and I tried to kind of convince my family that I go and study abroad, like some kind of like the science of studying Quran or like scripture, and how we derive rulings, because approaching religion from scripture is so much more spiritual than just going to figure out what the guidelines are for living, because it can kind of seem dry. But my dad's response was, it's difficult to know of kind of like an authoritative way of studying religion right now. Like, this was back then. And funny enough, because this was in June, right? And then 9/11 was that September. So it probably wouldn't have worked out anyway. But so it just didn't happen. Like, it was just like, all right, so I decided to just go to a local university here, and then ended up dropping out of my first year of science, and then I just took some time off and just kind of took that gap here, and just kind of allow myself to think about different alternatives for something that's kind of out of reach, and I have nothing to do other than just keep living and try to move on. So my intention in that scenario is, I have a spiritual thirst, and I need a quenching for it, and the hard sciences aren't really doing it for me. Like, I need something that's a little bit more literature based, or something that can give meaning other than this is how we measure things, and then this is the result, and we can vary things and measure them in different ways. But if it's not measurable, we have no way of talking about it in any quantifiable way, or even qualitative way, right? So I ended up kind of committing to self-study, kind of informally, in and out of going to conferences and kind of going to group sessions, like usually on the weekends or something like that. And it wasn't until, so basically my whole format for studying spirituality became very unorthodox. Like, it wasn't kind of like structured in a way where, like, you study this and then you build on it. It was kind of haphazard, but it was mostly around understanding the nature of existence. So very, very spiritual. And the process itself led me to kind of like a postmodern approach of studying religion and understanding life. So it's not at all what would have happened if I had gone to an institute in 2001 and studied it formally. Like, sometimes I think back and I think, if I had studied like the doctrine and all the traditional ways of studying tradition and religion, would I have been able to remain relevant and contemporary in a postmodern world? So 23 years later. And to me, I almost want to say no. I probably would have had a difficult time stepping out of that, because it's like I've been socialized, and the way I've been taught would have been, these are the guidelines, stay within inside, don't go outside, right? So I wouldn't have maybe tried to try alcohol, or try the marijuana, or delve out of my circle of friends and try to meet and relate with other kind of lifestyles and ways of living. And to me, this is important because it's almost like what I mentioned before, is that if you have an intention that you're trying to do yourself a justice by trying to understand meaning, then you're already facilitated in that way. Like the universe just opens itself up for you, and it maintains that contemporary aspect with it too, because you're trying to almost embody a way of living that makes sense to the majority of people without keeping you sort of marginalized. And somehow it all just connected for me. Like it was just, I think back and I'm almost like, I'm almost hard pressed not to want to share this with people, because I know a lot of the friends that I may have grown up with would, if they knew my story, they probably would have a hard time believing that it's relatable from the outside or from the inside of tradition, because it just seems like it's almost like a one-off and then that's the end. But going through some of the chats or like the threads on Facebook and reading some people's kind of curiosities about religion and creation, I think it's not ever going to be something that people write off. Like I think we're going to have times where the majority of people are just going to like write religion off and say, you know, it's violent, or it doesn't address all the human needs, right? So that's like a phase of time. And then with progress and with more people coming together and kind of building understanding and bridges with each other, and relative to what different practices kind of originated from, we just naturally want to kind of become easier to coexist with. And with that, traditional meanings that may have seemed kind of rigid sort of relax, and then that's good. Like that's kind of what we know of Christianity, right? Like you have, I know I came across a few friends who like just through conversations used to tell me that they would go to Bible studies, and they were rare, but they still exist, and they do have a certain kind of different vibe around them than other friends. And I appreciate all of it. Like I love that I have that and had that diversity like in my life with different acquaintances and coworkers. So I'm gonna leave it at that. It's kind of just like it's a really, really broad subject, and I don't want to delve in it in any kind of deep way that might actually require like a scholarly commentary, I guess, because this is kind of just mostly this is what worked for me. I hope some people can kind of derive some kind of I don't know, some kind of quenching or something to relate to that maybe they're struggling with and just need someone to kind of help them through, and just like, you know, it's not out of the ordinary that you'd want to have answers to these questions, and maybe a story that's kind of contemporary and relatable. So I'm gonna leave it at that. I don't know how to answer, like I know metaphysically in one lifetime it's difficult to say that you can have different lifetimes almost segmented in. I know in Islam we do have the belief that God can expand and constrict time without us really knowing about it, as it were, right? Because so kind of what I was talking about before, like how do I know that I'm kind of continuing on my dad's life for him without doing that in his body? So it's almost like if he was condemned to purgatory, for example, like he's going to come back to life and maybe have a lesser well-off life because, you know, tradition caught up with itself in a negative way, and the way he lived wouldn't have kind of informed him of that. But because I studied things, I can almost do things to help remedy that for him in some way. So it's a really interconnected way of seeing how we are not islands, and we're not meant to be cutting off family members, especially. Like one of the things that Islam really emphasizes is after you try to find meaning in your life, you really have to be careful with your next of kin and your family. And this is kind of like something that reinforces that for me. So it's just to say, like, we can't, not everyone has the luxury of saying I had an easy childhood, or my parents were good to me, or the style of parenting was something that I didn't struggle with. But regardless, it always could have been worse. So that's something to kind of go back to what I mentioned about how I came to study and how the knowledge that I have has accumulated. It's the epitome of ingratitude to just say that none of that helped me in any way, right? So the fact that they kind of gave you shelter and food, even if that's all it was, and it still had elements of neglect, it's still something, right? So if we keep that optimistic outlook and remain grateful, I think that's what opens up healthy ways of seeing and continuing to evolve out of kind of distressful or kind of difficult or unfortunate circumstances of living. So I'll keep it at that, and hopefully things will kind of narrow down again as we go.